My family abandoned Grandpa in a nursing home, so I brought him home and changed everything. I never thought those words would describe my own family, but one return birthday card changed my life forever. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from in the comments, and if you enjoy emotional stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. My name is Ren Ashby and I'm in my late 20s. I live in Cedar Falls, Ohio, where I work hard and try to build a simple, honest life. My grandfather, Walter Ashby, was the kindest person I had ever known. He taught me how to ride a bike, cheered at every school event, and always called me Rennie Bird, with a smile that made me feel safe. We used to talk often, but after starting a demanding new job, life became busy, and our calls became less frequent. Then one afternoon, an old birthday card I had mailed to him came back stamped, "Returned to sender." Confused and worried, I drove to Meadowbrook Senior Living to find him. At the front desk, the receptionist checked the records and quietly told me I was the first member of my family to visit Walter in 14 months. I could hardly believe it. A nurse led me to room 114 where I found my grandfather sitting alone by a window. When he finally recognized me, tears filled his eyes, and I knew I would never leave him behind again. When I got home that evening, I couldn't shake the image of Grandpa Walter sitting alone by that window. The look on his face stayed with me the entire drive. He had smiled when he recognized me, but behind that smile was fear. It was the fear that I would walk away like everyone else and never return. I parked outside my house but didn't go inside. I sat there in complete silence holding my phone. Then I opened the family group chat that I had muted months earlier. I was tired of the endless complaints and small arguments, so I had stopped paying attention. That night I decided to read everything I had missed. The first few messages made my heart sink. My mom Diane had written, "Dad called again today. 3 times already. He's just rambling." A few minutes later Aunt Carla replied, "Don't answer him. It only encourages him." Then my dad Roger added a laughing emoji and said, "He probably forgot he already called." I stared at those words for a long time. That wasn't the grandfather I knew. I remembered our phone calls before life got so busy. Grandpa never rambled. He always asked how work was going. He wanted to know if I was getting enough sleep and whether I was eating proper meals. Sometimes he talked about the weather or told me a funny story from years ago. Looking back, I realized he wasn't calling because he was confused. He was calling because he wanted someone to talk to. As I kept scrolling, things became even worse. My Aunt Pam wrote, "Just let the facility handle everything. That's what we're paying them for." Not one person suggested visiting him. Not one message asked if he was lonely. Nobody talked about taking him out for lunch or spending an afternoon with him. Instead, every conversation was about paperwork, bills, appointments, and legal forms. Then I noticed several messages mentioning Grandpa's house. They didn't explain much, but they talked about documents and timing. At that moment, I didn't understand why they kept bringing it up, so I moved on. The more I read, the clearer everything became. My family hadn't simply become busy. They had slowly stopped treating Grandpa like he mattered. They convinced themselves they were doing the right thing while finding one excuse after another not to see him. Reading those messages felt like watching someone slowly disappear while everyone pretended nothing was wrong. I put my phone down and covered my face with my hands. I felt guilty for missing the signs and angry that nobody had spoken up. After a few minutes, I made one decision that changed everything. I was going back to Meadowbrook the next morning, and this time I wasn't asking anyone if I should. The next morning, I woke up hoping there was a simple explanation for everything I had seen. Maybe my family had made mistakes. Maybe they didn't realize how lonely Grandpa Walter had become. I picked up my phone and called my mom first, expecting her to be glad that someone had finally gone to see him. Instead, her voice sounded careful. "Honey," she said, "I really don't think you should get involved. He's difficult now. He probably wouldn't even remember you." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "That's not true," I answered. The moment he saw me, he called me Rennie Bird. He knew exactly who I was. The line went silent for a few seconds. Then, without responding to what I had said, Mom started asking about my job and whether work was keeping me busy. She acted like the conversation about Grandpa had never happened. After we hung up, I called Aunt Carla. I thought maybe she would tell me something different, but I got almost the same answer. "He's changed," she said. "It's better to remember him the way he used to be. Visiting only makes things harder." The words sounded rehearsed, almost like everyone had agreed to tell the same story. They all described Grandpa in nearly the same way. That couldn't be a coincidence. Later that evening, I drove to my parents' house and found my dad in the kitchen. I didn't waste time. "Did any of you try to stop me from seeing Grandpa?" I asked. Dad kept looking down at the counter instead of meeting my eyes. "We were just trying to avoid upsetting things," he said quietly. "The staff knows how to handle situations like this." "What situation?" I asked. He opened his mouth then closed it again. He had no answer. I left feeling even more confused than before. That night I decided I was done guessing. I called Meadowbrook Senior Living and politely asked if they could tell me about Grandpa's visitor records and phone history. Then I asked one question that had been bothering me all day. Did anyone from my family ever ask the staff to limit his calls or discourage him from reaching out? The woman on the phone became very quiet. After a long pause, she finally answered. "Yes," she said softly. "We received requests from a family member asking us to manage his expectations about visits because they didn't want him becoming disappointed." My heart started racing. I took a deep breath before asking one final question. "Can you tell me who made those requests?" There was another pause. Then she quietly read the name from the call log. It was my mother. 2 days later, I went back to Meadowbrook Senior Living. This time I carried a small notebook in my bag. Something told me I needed to start keeping track of everything I was learning because the pieces of this story were slowly coming together. I found Grandpa Walter sitting alone in the common room. He was working on a crossword puzzle at a table that could seat 4 people, but every other chair was empty. His pen barely worked and I watched him shake it a few times before trying to write another word. The moment he looked up and saw me, his whole face changed. "Rennie Bird," he said with a smile. Hearing that nickname again made me smile too. For a few minutes we laughed, talked about ordinary things, and it almost felt like old times. Then our conversation became more serious. Grandpa quietly admitted that he used to call the family every week. Sometimes he called every day. If nobody answered, he left voicemail after voicemail, hoping someone would eventually call back. "I never understood why everyone got so busy," he said. "I thought maybe I was calling at the wrong time." My heart broke listening to him. He wasn't angry. He wasn't blaming anyone. He honestly believed he had done something wrong. Then he told me about a nurse named Denise. She noticed that nobody ever brought him books, puzzles, or little gifts. Whenever she could, she found extra crossword books and quietly left them in his room. Grandpa smiled as he talked about her kindness. Then his smile slowly disappeared. "After a while," he said softly, "I stopped calling so much. Hearing the voicemail every time hurt more than I expected." I had to look away for a second because I didn't want him to see the tears in my eyes. Before leaving, I spoke with one of the aides who had been caring for him. I asked if she could tell me honestly what she had seen over the past year. She explained that family visits were extremely rare. When relatives did call, the conversations were usually about paperwork, bills, or other practical matters. Very few people asked how Walter was actually feeling. Then she shared something I will never forget. Several months earlier, she had overheard Grandpa talking with another resident. He quietly said he believed his family was just waiting him out. Those words stayed with me all the way home. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my decision had already been made. I wasn't going to leave Grandpa there any longer. I didn't care if my family agreed or not. He deserved to spend his days in a home where someone wanted him there, and I was going to make sure he had exactly that. I honestly believed the hardest part would be convincing Grandpa to leave Meadowbrook. I couldn't have been more wrong. The real challenge was telling the rest of my family what I had decided. A few days later, everyone gathered at my parents' house for dinner. Around the table sat my dad, Roger, my mom, Diane, my Aunt Carla, and my Aunt Pam. They thought it was just another family meal, but I had asked everyone to come because I had something important to say. Once dinner was served, I took a deep breath. "I've made my decision," I said. "Grandpa is moving in with me." The room became completely silent. "I've already prepared my guest room. I spoke with his doctor about a safe transition, and I'll make sure he gets everything he needs. I'm not asking for permission. I'm simply letting all of you know." Nobody answered right away. Instead, I noticed my mom and Aunt Carla exchange a quick look. It wasn't surprise. It looked more like they were silently trying to figure out what to say next. Finally, my mom spoke. "Ren, you don't understand what you're taking on," she said. "He needs professional care." Before I could respond, Aunt Carla joined in. You've never cared for someone his age before. You'll be exhausted within a few weeks." Then Aunt Pam quietly asked, "What happens to the arrangements?" I looked at her. "What arrangements?" She immediately changed the subject and never explained what she meant. Dad tried to calm everyone down. "Maybe we should all think about this for a while," he suggested. I slowly shook my head. "I've already spent enough time thinking." Then I looked around the table. Grandpa spent 14 months waiting for someone to visit him. Almost nobody did. I spoke with the staff. They told me family members asked them to discourage him from expecting visits. They also told me Grandpa believed everyone was simply waiting him out. Nobody interrupted me. Nobody said the staff was wrong. Nobody claimed Grandpa had imagined it. Most importantly, nobody apologized. The silence around that table said more than any excuse ever could. Then my mom leaned forward and said something I don't think I'll ever forget. "You're going to make this whole family look terrible." I waited for her to say something about Grandpa. Maybe that she missed him. Maybe that she felt guilty. Maybe that she wished things had been different. But those words never came. The only thing she seemed worried about was how other people might judge the family. In that moment, everything became clear. They weren't upset because Grandpa was leaving the nursing home. They were upset because someone had finally stopped pretending everything was fine. And I knew I was making the right decision, no matter how uncomfortable it made the rest of them. The day I brought Grandpa Walter home should have been one of the happiest days of our lives. Instead, it became the day my family finally showed me exactly where they stood. Checking him out of Meadowbrook took most of the morning. I expected boxes and bags, but there wasn't much to pack. A few sweaters, some family photos in an old shoebox, a small radio, and the crossword book Nurse Denise had given him. Inside the front cover was a handwritten note that read, "You matter. Don't let them tell you different." I folded that note and slipped it into my pocket. For some reason I didn't want to let it out of my sight. The drive home was quiet. Grandpa looked out the window almost the entire time, smiling as we passed neighborhoods and parks. It felt like he was seeing the world again after being locked away for far too long. When we arrived at my house, I showed him the guest room. It wasn't anything special. There was a comfortable bed, a reading lamp, a small dresser, and a window that looked over my backyard. Birds gathered near the fence every afternoon and flowers grew along the walkway. Grandpa stepped inside and looked around without saying a word. Then tears filled his eyes. He slowly touched the doorframe with his hand, almost as if he needed to prove the room was real. "You made this for me?" he asked. I smiled and nodded. "It's your home now." He hugged me tighter than he had in years. That moment alone made every difficult conversation worth it. But the peace didn't last very long. That evening my phone started ringing. First it was my mom. I didn't answer. Then Aunt Carla called. A few minutes later Aunt Pam left a voicemail. She started calmly but quickly became angry. She accused me of making the family look heartless and embarrassing everyone. Every message sounded different, but they all had the same complaint. None of them asked how Grandpa was doing. They only cared about how my decision made them appear. Later that night my dad called. His voice sounded tired. "You've made this much harder than it needed to be," he said. I looked across the room. Grandpa was sitting at my kitchen table, smiling as he finished dinner. "Harder for who?" I asked quietly. "For Grandpa, who's finally eating in a home where someone wants him. Or for the people who stopped visiting him?" Dad didn't answer. A few seconds later the call ended. After Grandpa went to bed I sat alone on my back porch, completely exhausted but strangely at peace. Then one final message appeared on my phone. It was from Aunt Carla. It contained only 5 words. "You have no idea, Ren." I read that message several times, wondering what she meant. Deep down I knew this story wasn't over yet. Over the next few weeks, something happened that nobody in my family expected. Every day Grandpa Walter became a little stronger, a little happier, and a little more like the man I remembered growing up. It wasn't easy taking care of him, but I never regretted my decision. Every morning we shared coffee at the kitchen table while working on crossword puzzles together. Sometimes he solved the clues before I did and we laughed about it. In the afternoons we went to his doctor's appointments or took slow walks around the neighborhood. At first we could only make it to the corner before he became tired. A week later we reached the next block. Soon we were walking through the nearby park together. Every small step felt like a victory. In the evenings we opened old photo albums. Grandpa told me stories I had never heard before. He talked about his childhood, his parents, and the small house he built with his own hands many years ago. I listened for hours because I realized these memories could have disappeared forever if nobody had been there to hear them. The biggest surprise came during one of his medical checkups. His doctor smiled as he compared Grandpa's recent progress with his earlier records. "He's doing much better," the doctor said. "This happens more often than people realize. Loneliness and depression can make memory problems seem much worse. When someone feels loved, stays active, and has a daily routine, they often improve." Hearing those words made everything clear. Grandpa hadn't needed a miracle. He had simply needed someone who cared enough to spend time with him. Before long, news reached the rest of the family. One of my cousins later told me Aunt Carla had mentioned that Grandpa was doing better than expected. She didn't sound happy. She sounded almost disappointed. A few days later, my mom finally came to visit. It lasted less than an hour. She looked surprised when Grandpa greeted her by name, remembered old family events, and asked simple questions about why nobody had visited him for so long. Instead of looking relieved, she seemed uncomfortable. She kept changing the subject whenever he asked about the past. After she left, Grandpa quietly looked out the window for a long time. That visit left me with more questions than answers. If everyone truly believed Grandpa was getting better, why did they seem nervous instead of grateful? I couldn't ignore that feeling anymore. Ever since I started reading those old messages, I had learned to notice the small things people tried to hide. The strange looks, the unfinished sentences, and the sudden changes of topic all pointed toward something bigger. I still didn't know what my family was keeping from me, but I was more certain than ever that there was a reason they never wanted Grandpa to find his voice again. A few days after my mom's visit, things took a turn I never expected. My family realized that guilt wasn't going to change my mind, so they tried something much colder. One afternoon, I found a certified letter in my mailbox. It wasn't from anyone in my family. It came from a lawyer whose name I had never heard before. The letter claimed he represented my family's interests regarding Grandpa Walter's care and estate. As I kept reading, my hands grew cold. The letter suggested that my decision to bring Grandpa home could be legally challenged. It also claimed there were concerns about his declining mental condition and questioned whether he was capable of making important decisions. I couldn't believe it. They were using the same story they had told me before, only now it was written on official paper. The next morning, I took the letter straight to Grandpa's doctor. He read every page carefully before looking up at me. "This doesn't match his medical records at all," he said. "Over the past several weeks, Walter has shown steady improvement. I have no reason to describe him as mentally incapable." Hearing that gave me confidence, but it also made me wonder how far my family was willing to go. When I showed the letter to Grandpa, he read it slowly from beginning to end. His hands stayed steady and his expression became more serious with every line. He folded the paper, placed it on the table, and quietly shook his head. "I never thought it would come to this," he whispered. A few days later, Aunt Pam showed up at my front door without calling first. She smiled, hugged me, and started looking through old family photos as if nothing had happened. She talked about happy memories and said everyone missed being together. For a moment, I almost believed she had come to make peace. Then her tone changed. "You've always liked being the hero," she said. "You've also always made simple things more difficult than they need to be." I didn't argue. I had started noticing something important. None of them ever asked if Grandpa was healthy. None of them asked whether he was sleeping well or enjoying life. Every conversation was about me. About my choices. About my reputation. Never about him. That evening, Grandpa and I sat together at the kitchen table with coffee. The house was quiet. He looked at me for a long moment before setting his cup down. "Ren," he said softly, "there's something I've never told anyone." I looked up immediately. "You're the only one who came back for me," he continued. "That means you're the only person who's earned the truth." My notebook was sitting beside me, but I didn't even reach for it. Something told me that what Grandpa was about to say would explain everything that had happened from the very beginning. Grandpa Walter took a deep breath before he started talking. I could tell this wasn't something he had decided to share overnight. It was a memory he had carried by himself for years. "This whole story started long before the nursing home," he said quietly. I stayed silent and let him continue. Several years earlier, he had gone to a doctor's appointment. The visit ended sooner than expected, so he came home earlier than usual. As he walked toward the kitchen, he heard voices inside. It was my dad, Roger, my mom, Diane, and Aunt Carla. They didn't know he was home. Instead of calling out to them, he stopped in the hallway. Then he heard words he could never forget. They were talking about his house. Not about fixing it. Not about helping him take care of it. They were discussing what would happen after he was gone. Grandpa said they spoke so calmly that it hurt even more. Nobody sounded angry or upset. They talked about selling the house quickly and dividing the money between themselves. Someone even mentioned they should do it before nursing home expenses reduced its value. They spoke as if I had already disappeared, Grandpa said, staring down at his coffee. He wasn't crying. His voice was calm. That somehow made it even more painful. I asked him why he never confronted them. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. Because I was afraid of the truth, he admitted. If I asked them about it, they might tell me I misunderstood. They might apologize. But deep inside, I needed to know whether their actions would match those words. So he said nothing. Instead, he quietly watched what happened over the following years. The phone calls became shorter. Family visits became less frequent. Eventually, they suggested moving him into Meadowbrook. Looking back, he realized everything had happened exactly the way they had planned. I started believing that maybe this was simply how my life would end, he said softly. Not with people being openly cruel. Just forgotten. My heart broke hearing those words. Then Grandpa looked directly at me. You're the only person I've ever told, he said. Every time you called me, I never felt like you wanted something from me. You just wanted to hear my voice. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then a question suddenly came into my mind. Grandpa, I asked carefully, who owns the house now? Do you still have the deed? A small smile appeared on his face for the first time that evening. Yes, he replied. I still have it. He paused for just a second before adding one more sentence. And it's not in the name your family thinks it is. At that moment, I realized the truth was even bigger than I had imagined. Grandpa Walter smiled gently before explaining the final piece. After overhearing that conversation years earlier, he didn't argue with anyone. Instead, he hired his own lawyer and quietly changed his estate plan. The house everyone believed they would one day divide had been placed into a trust. It had one simple condition. The house would belong to the person who came back for him without expecting anything in return. Nobody knew that condition existed. I never visited Grandpa because I wanted a house. I went to Meadowbrook because a returned birthday card told me something wasn't right. I simply wanted my grandfather back. A week later, my parents and both of my aunts showed up at my front door. They had learned about the trust after the lawyer reviewed everything because of the legal letter they had sent. Now they were angry. They accused me of manipulating Grandpa and turning him against the family. They claimed I only cared about money. I stayed calm. I reminded them of the 14 months they never visited him. I reminded them of the phone calls they ignored, the request to stop giving him hope about family visits, and the words they used when they said he probably wouldn't even remember me. Then I told them Grandpa had overheard their conversation about selling his house years before any of this happened. His silence had never been confusion. It was the heartbreak of hearing his own children plan a future without him. Nobody had an answer. Grandpa looked at them from his porch chair and quietly said, I hope one day you find what you were really looking for because it was never me. Without another word, they turned around and left. I closed the front door, sat beside Grandpa on the porch and picked up the crossword puzzle we had been working on. We smiled at each other, finished the last few clues together, and enjoyed the peaceful afternoon we should have shared long ago. Please like, subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know what you would have done in my place.